One other housekeeping comment that I do want to make. We've got a very ambitious schedule today, and I'm the timekeeper. So there is always the tyranny of the clock, I'm afraid, even though there's so much fascinating material to discuss on when we're talking about somebody who had such a rich and diverse and important life as Governor Otto Kerner. But let me start very quickly with some PowerPoint presentation here. I'm also the keeper of the PowerPoint. At each beginning of each one of these, we want to introduce the presentation with a little bit of information from some of the material we've been collecting here in our archives. In this case, that's not the right one, I don't think. In this case, I wanted to start with a short audio excerpt from somebody who we all wish would have been here, and that's Senator Dawn Clark Netsch, who served in the Kerner administration in those crucial first 3 or 4 years. So here is Senator Netsch talking about what she viewed as the priorities for Governor Kerner.
He felt very strongly about, something like the sanctity of the judicial system and independence of the judiciary. And I saw that because we were in the process, while he was governor, of changing some parts of the judicial code, much for the better. We didn't get rid of the election of judges, but there were major restructuring, in a sense, of the judicial code, which I thought he was very, very interested in. Probably the thing that he had the most impact on, that I'm not sure everyone would have associated him with, was in civil rights and civil liberties. And he obviously felt those things very strongly. And we saw it, well, in several ways. Number one, legislatively, we got the first Fair Employment Practices Commission law passed, and which was a real major breakthrough. It doesn't sound like much, but in retrospect, it was the first time that employment discrimination based on race or ethnicity was not legal, was illegal in the state of Illinois. And we were probably about the last northern reasonably industrial, reasonably liberal state that passed FEPC. So that was a big breakthrough. And then we went through an unbelievable series of events in making the appointments to the first FEPC. Gee, I'd forgotten about all of that. He was very good in really reaching out for some people that would have made that first one work well, which of course was very important. And one of them got turned down by the Senate. And I was the one who was involved in all of that. Then actually, after that, the question was whether we would go after housing discrimination, which of course is much more sensitive. And we did support it. Did not make it. I mean, we didn't get that passed. That wouldn't have been the same year. So it was either the second year of that legislative session, or it might have been the second session that I was there working.
1963, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, how about this question? Would you describe Kerner as more of a politician or an executive who wanted to get things done once he got to office?
Executive. I wouldn't have any hesitancy in saying that. I suppose anybody who had gotten that far is a bit of a politician, but he did not come through as a heavily political type. And some of what he'd done, remember, he'd been the county judge, and a lot of what he'd worked with was with the mentally ill, because all of those who were being committed or questioned or whatever went through the county judge in Cook County. And so that was something that, he'd had a lot of experience with and was obviously very empathetic. And I thought of him more on those things and in connection with a lot of those things. He was marvelous. We had a very dramatic, innovative legislative program. And he loved all of this stuff. And I think I may have mentioned before that one of the things that he was well known and respected for at the time was his willingness to stand up on a lot of the both civil rights and civil liberties issues. And he also, one of the other things that was very important, because we didn't pass as much of the non-discrimination legislation as we would have liked. We got FEPC, but we hadn't gone beyond that. And one of the things that he did that I was heavily involved in working on with Roger Nathan at the time, so the two of us sort of worked on an executive order which the governor wanted and signed, which basically prohibited discrimination in any public services or anything that had sort of public money in it. And we could do that. We couldn't affect the private sector without legislative authority. But in our judgment, we could say, the governor could say, as the chief executive of the state, we will not administer any of our programs in any way, whether it's scholarships or education funding or health funding or whatever it might be. We will not administer any of it in a way that discriminates on racial or ethnic grounds. And that executive order got a lot of attention when it was promulgated.
So, let me start with a very quick introduction. I'm going to set the standard here for introductions for today because we don't want to take time to do that necessarily. And quite frankly, our first moderator is somebody who doesn't need an introduction, really. Governor of the state from 1991 to 1999. Governor Jim Edgar, I learned when I had the interview with him, has been fascinated by Illinois politics and Illinois governance at a very young age. I also want to point out, in terms of our setting the stage for today, that he began his career in the state government in 1968 as a legislative intern working for the Senate Republicans and learning the ropes from Senator W. Russell Arrington. By the early 1970s, he had moved on to the Illinois House, worked for Robert Blair, and gave him an inside seat to state politics while learning from some of the most skilled politicians of the day. So, Governor Edgar.
Thank you, Mark. That's too long of an introduction, too. You guys won't get that long. Just to tell you, we've got about an hour to cover a lot of territory. Let me first just say, I never had the pleasure of meeting or knowing Governor Kerner personally. I did have the opportunity, though, when I was a freshman in college. I was home on semester break, and I had a friend from Charleston who was a big Democrat. And he wanted to go to Springfield and hear Otto Kerner give his State of the State address in the beginning of his second term in, I think it was January of 1965. So for the first time in my life, I came to the state capitol. And I remember sitting upstairs, and that was the at-large house. So you had all these semi-famous Illinoisans, I called them, because I don't know if there weren't any sports figures, so there really wasn't anybody really famous down there. But you had a Stevenson and you had an Eisenhower, and I remember watching all that, and I was just fascinated with all the, what I thought the glamour, and little did I know I was going to spend most of the rest of my life wandering around that place. But what I remember is that right before the speech, they brought a chair out and put it right in front of the podium, and Mrs. Kerner came out and sat down, and then Governor Kerner came out and gave his speech. Now, I would like to tell you, I could tell you the major points of that speech. I don't remember a thing about that speech, except I just remember I was fascinated to think everybody in this assembly and all the crowd, they were just riveted on what that gentleman, the governor, had to say. And it probably when I first really appreciated being governor really means something, at least in the House of Representatives when you're given the State of the State address. Now, the other thing I remember about Governor Kerner is when I became Secretary of State, then governor, I got to know a lot of the community leaders in Springfield. And one of the things that always struck me, and most of these people were Republicans, the thing that struck me that they all had, their favorite governor was Governor Kerner. And they said because Governor Kerner, he was part of the community. He was, he was somebody you could walk up to and talk to. And even when Governor Kerner was governor, they gave him the Outstanding Citizen Award for Springfield. My, how times have changed today. Well, I don't personally know that Governor Kerner, but we do fortunately have a panel of people who do know Governor Kerner, knew him, worked with him, and I can think share a lot of insight. Now we have three people who are sitting here on the panel today. First is Bill Feurer. Bill started out as a press person, a news person, but then he got hired by the Kerner administration. Now, I'm speaking from memory. I had a bio on everybody, and it's probably age. Some here in the room used to work for me, and they would say this has always been a problem with me. I went and got a folder to put that bio sheet in, and I got here and took the folder out of the car and realized I forgot to put the bio sheet into the folder. So if I don't get everything exactly right, I apologize. But Bill was then hired by the Kerner administration to work in their press office. And he did that during many years of the Kerner administration. Then after that, he went to law school and came back and has practiced law in Springfield. I first met Bill when he was doing some work for the Senate Republicans, and I was working for, or Senate Democrats, excuse me. Senate Democrats, and I was working for the Senate Republicans. And always had a great deal of respect for Bill. Even though he was on the other side, he was somebody that I always thought was very knowledgeable and always level with you. Now we have Gene Slickman, Representative Slickman, who had served, I think his first 2 years during the last part of the Kerner administration, was to be here, but he wasn't able to be here. Now I've got to kind of alert the other members on this panel. Gene can't be here because he's preparing for heart surgery. Bill just had some heart work done on him about a few weeks ago, and about 3 months ago, I had heart work done on me again. So if the two of you get a kind of a chest pain, say something. Oh, you've already had it too,
I
right?
didn't lose the bio. I managed to keep it. So
Okay.
if you
Well,
want it,
so
you won't mix me up with it.
I won't mix you up. So filling in for Gene is Bill Barnhart. Bill Barnhart was a newsman. He covered Springfield during the Walker years. Then he went back for the Tribune. Then he went back to the Tribune and had a business column for many, many years. And when he left the newspaper business, he, along with Gene Slickman, worked on a biography and published on Otto Kerner, which I read. And what I know about Otto Kerner that I haven't heard around the halls of Springfield, I found out from that book that Bill and Gene wrote. They also, I think, wrote a book, which I did not read, on Justice Stevens. So we're delighted to have him to fill in for Gene. I think you're doing double duty, aren't you? Aren't you
Yes.
on two panels? Yeah, you ought to get paid double then.
I'm sure I will.
Our last panelist, Lowell Sachnoff, he was very much involved with Governor Kerner in his reform of mental health. In fact, Lowell wrote the code, the mental health code that was adopted. And after his time with the Kerner administration, he is involved in a variety of legal groups. He also practices law in Chicago. And I'm not going to get the one right, but the civil, tell me the one you chair, or you chaired the American Civil Liberties, or?
Well, if you mean way back when, Dawn Clark and I were members of something called the Committee on Illinois Government.
No.
Later on?
This is really a really good government thing, yeah.
Well, it's hard for me to figure that out,
Okay.
Governor, because
I was
didn't-
impressed, but you show how long my memory
I
lasts.
have to look
these
at my
days.
own bio.
No, that's all. That's all right.
Let's
We don't
see.
want to delay. We don't want to delay.
Oh, here we go.
But anyway, I will now turn it over to three gentlemen who know much about Governor Kerner. And the first thing I would like him is just to kind of give their thoughts, looking back now many years later, on the Kerner administration and particularly on Governor Kerner. And Bill, we're going to start with you.
Well, if you talk about reminiscing, why, I think most of us who worked for Governor Kerner, he had a very small staff compared to subsequent organizations when life changed in the governor's office. He only had about 6 or 7 assistants. We all had the same title, assistant to the governor. We weren't all the same thing, of course. We had a press secretary, we had the legislative assistant, we had a legal assistant, and then we had a couple of catch-all assistants, of which I eventually became one of those with no title. I think that if the one thing that strikes us as we think back is the fact that probably it was the best experience in our lives for every one of us. You know, Kerner was a wonderful guy to work for. I never heard him chew out a single staff member. I never heard him complain about another staff member to any other staff members. I never heard him say bad things about Republicans, Democrats. I mean, he just was he acted like a gentleman on the surface and in public. He acted like a gentleman on the surface and private. He was the same person when he did those kind of things. I'm sure we made some horrendous blunders, which fortunately we've wiped from our mind, but the fact is he was very, very good man to work for, and he was very even-handed, and it's probably the great privilege of my life to have been able to be on his staff.
Lowell?
My name is Lowell Sachnoff, and I was 4 years out of law school, sitting in my office, a junior associate at a big Chicago law firm, and Dawn Clark, she is gone now, Dawn Clark Netsch, gave me a call one day because she'd just been appointed as Kerner's legal counsel. And she said, Lowell, there's lots of work that has to be done in Springfield. Could you come down for about 6 months, take a leave of absence, and be my assistant? Because he said we had a lot of legislation had to be drafted. So I talked to Carl McGowan, one of the senior partners. He said, yeah, you ought to do it, and I did. Went down to Springfield. I was down for 10 days, sitting in Dawn's office when Kerner walked in, and he said to me, Lowell, what do you know about mental health and public welfare? I said, absolutely nothing. He said, good. You're going to be assistant to the director of the Department of Public Welfare, and you're going to be special counsel to the director, Francis Gertie, and you've got a pile of stuff to do. And I looked at him and said, wait a minute. I said, that's the biggest department in state government, which it was, like 16,000 employees, 28,000 or 48,000 patients in mental hospitals. I said, Governor, I don't know anything about this. He said, I looked at your resume. He said, you went to Harvard Law School. He said, you got to be smart enough to fix it. So I said, okay, I'll do it. So I did then move over and ended up working for one of the great people I've ever known, and that's Francis Gertie, who preceded Harold Vysotsky as the director of the department, then the Department of Public Welfare. It was this huge, sprawling department that covered public welfare, mental health, children and family services, and the Department of Alcoholism. Everything was literally bundled into this department. And Francis Gertie said to me, Lowell, you got 3 things that we have to do. We need to reorganize the department, we need a new mental health code, and we need to spend $50 million that have been appropriated by the legislature to fix the mental hospitals in the state. And I need to speak a word about Francis Gertie because he succeeded in the Department of Public Welfare. Bill Stratton was governor at the time. Otto Bettag was the head of the Department of Public Welfare, really mental health hospitals, 17 of them. And Bettag wasn't even a doctor. He had absolutely no qualifications to be able to handle this critical job. And Governor Kerner approached Francis Gertie, who had just finished a term as president of the American Psychiatric Association. He was one of the most credentialed, qualified psychiatrists in the country. And the idea of replacing an 18th century system headed up by an unqualified person with one of the leading psychiatrists in the country that day was incredible. And at first, Dr. Gertie said, I'm not sure I can do this. He had lots of other responsibilities. And Governor Kerner said to him, you have to do it because the people of the state of Illinois need someone like you to reform this antiquated system. And Dr. Gertie said, I'll do it on one condition, and that is that I am free of all political pressure, because he did his own investigation of what goes on in Springfield, the thought of $50 million to be spent, and he said, I need to be free of political pressure, and if you can commit that to me, Governor Kerner, I'll take the job. Well, he did, and when I went over to work for him, as I said, I was 30 years old. I was green around the gills. I'd never been in state government before. And when Dr. Gertie said, these are the 3 things we have to do, we ended up doing them. And the first 2 were relatively easy. We drafted a new mental health code. Well, first thing we had to do was reorganize the department. We split it up into the Department of Mental Health on one hand and the Department of Children and Family Services on the other. And there was very little opposition, very little, there was no squabbling, no political concerns about doing that. The second thing was the new mental health code. I looked at the mental health code in 1961, and I don't think it had been amended much in the way of substantive provisions until 10 years after Mary Todd Lincoln had been committed, I think, in the middle of the 19th century, or about, I think it was 1870 or 1869, after the Civil War. And so that was not a political issue either. Everybody knew the mental health code had to be reformed, and we worked through and we did that. The third aspect, and maybe most important in terms of Governor Kerner and his character, was the fact that the legislature had appropriated $50 million for improving the 17 mental hospitals and the 17 facilities that were serving the mentally ill and retarded in the state. Now think back for a moment to 1961. $50 million today would be worth about $130 million, and it was red meat to the politicians in Springfield when they realized that they could then appoint architects and construction companies to build these facilities. It was a huge amount of money, and the problems that surrounded what to do with that money and how to have it well spent were manifest. But the first one was that the legislature, in its wisdom, said that this money had to be spent at the existing mental hospitals. 1961, the existing 17 mental hospitals in Illinois were nothing more than custodial warehouses for mental patients. It was like the advertisement for roaches. People went in and never came out. It was a snake pit, to put it bluntly. They were terrible. The problem was that the legislature said the money had to be spent at the hospitals, but I learned at the Harvard Law School that sometimes you could do a little legislative sleight of hand, and I was able to amend the statute before the money was appropriated to include the word enhance the existing mental hospitals, which meant that the money didn't have to be spent at them, but it had to be spent to help them and near them. And as a result of that, the 7 zone clinics that still exist and that really brought mental health in Illinois into the 20th century, those 7 zone centers were built. At the time, the director of public works was a man named Francis Lorenz. The assistant director of the Department of Mental Health was a man named Herbert Lowry. Herbert Lowry had been a Democratic committee chairman in Rock Island, had delivered Rock Island big for Otto Kerner. The problem with Herbert Lowry being assistant to the director, I was sort of special assistant to the director. I was more special than Herbert Lowry. And the problem was that he was a politician who simply wanted to make certain that the people who worked so hard for Otto Kerner in Rock Island got jobs and got work. And we had a 6-month tug of war between Herbert Lowry and Frank Lorenz, head of public works, about their desire to hire their friends as the architects to design the 7 zone centers, and their friends who were contractors to build them. And we had probably 10 meetings with Governor Kerner in which Dr. Gertie and I would go in and Lowry and Lorenz would go in first, and they would say, God damn it, Gertie and Sachnoff are not letting any of our friends get any of the jobs here. And when we went in, there wasn't one time that Governor Kerner didn't say, Dr. Gertie, Lowell, you absolutely have not my permission and endorsement, but I insist that politics never enters into any of these decisions at all. You pick the best people to build these hospitals and to design the hospitals, and the best people to build them. And on every occasion, we did just that. And it was a testament to Governor Kerner's character that he never, ever permitted any political decisions to enter into the construction of what ended up being, and the Kennedy administration in Washington named the new Department of Mental Health and the work that we did there as a model for the nation, and it was. And we moved mental health in Illinois from being 45th in the country in terms of the states that provided good mental health care to first we did this literally in 2.5 years. So it was the model achievement of the Kerner administration. And in going through my file, I found this. we don't have a PowerPoint to show it, but it's an article by Tom Littlewood written at the end of the first session in July of 1961. It says, "Mental health care best assembly gain." And it was. And it was attributable 100% to the fact that Governor Kerner would not be swayed by political considerations in selecting the very best people to design, to build, and to run the zone centers. And he was remarkable in that. Herbert Lowry, a quick aside, Lowry finally, with a little help from the press, we were able to demonstrate the fact that he was always coming to us about hiring his best people. And although he never really offered me a bribe, he made it very clear that if I helped him select so-and-so as an architect and so-and-so as the construction company, he would, quote, "It would help me in my private practice when I went back to Chicago." It was a subtle attempt at bribery, but I was young enough and impressed enough by what Kerner insisted that we do that we never let it enter any of the decisions that were made. So, a quick story about Dr. Gertie, and then I'll end this part of it. As a psychiatrist who not only was in private practice but had a long history in public mental health care, we visited every one of the mental hospitals in the state. That was our job. And the prior director, Otto Kerner, almost never left Springfield. He was a political appointee of Stratton, kind of a bureaucrat who really didn't understand the needs of and proper care for the mentally ill. We were at the Dixon State Hospital for the mentally retarded and walking through the wards, and it was like a page out of Dickens. It was a true snake pit. It was children who had had no care at all, and just the basic elements of good care not being provided for them. Dr. Gertie walked over to a young lad, could have been 9 years old or so, took a look at him and asked what his diagnosis was, and it was, every diagnosis read the same, mental retardation with no and as you know today, there may be 100 different kinds of mental disabilities under that category. Dr. Gertie walked up to this child, and in back of him, he went like this, and there was no response. And then he said to me, because I had a microphone with me, we were walking around, he said, "Lowell, hit it as hard as you can in back of this child's head." And I did that with a loud noise. No response at all. And it turned out that this child of 8 was deaf, had absolutely no mental disabilities at all, but because he wasn't responding properly, he didn't seem to be maturing for his age, he was just dumped into a mental hospital. That's the kind of personal care that Francis Gertie, with the absolute support of Otto Kerner, provided in every one of the state's 17 hospitals for the mentally ill and retarded. So it was really an incredible experience. I do need to give a 30-second aside. Some mention was made of Paul Powell. I stayed at the St. Nicholas Hotel at the time. All of you remember the shoebox story. This is the floor, let's say, of the St. Nick Hotel. Paul Powell's room was here, and mine was 50 feet away, and I never knew, all the time that I was in Springfield, that I was 50 feet away from $800,000 in cash stuffed in a shoebox. And I was probably in Paul Powell's room because he was always asking for jobs, because the Department of Mental Health was the largest employer in the state, and I probably ended up being 5 feet away from this shoebox. Bill tells me it was all in one shoebox, but I'm not sure how that, and bags and stuff like that. But that was another example of Governor Kerner's absolute statement that under no circumstances would Paul Powell, consummate politician, always looking for jobs, that under no circumstances would we let him Powell influence any of the decisions that were made to spend the money, the huge amount of money that was appropriated to improve mental health in Illinois. And so, as I said, it was done. And Illinois, when I left, I was supposed to stay for 6 months. I left 2 years later and went back into private practice. And in all the years as a lawyer in the city, I ended up as a senior partner in a major law firm. There's nothing that I did in my career as a lawyer that gave me more gratification than the 2 years that I spent working with Otto Kerner, with Francis Gertie, and later with Harold Vysotsky in developing Illinois into the best mental health system in the country.
Thank you, Lowell. And just for a side, just a side note, Paul Powell was Speaker of the House at that point too, so that was pretty tough to keep the Speaker out. Bill?
Thank you. Unlike these gentlemen, I never met or had an opportunity to interview Otto Kerner, but I did see him once when I was a student at Knox College, and he and Charles Percy were campaigning for governor in the 1964 election. And what I remember about that, they both were there, unlike today, and those of you who remember those times know that Otto Kerner and Charles Percy got along very well together. I don't know if I necessarily call them friends socially, but the point is that they respected one another, and the tone of the campaign was so much different than what we see today sometimes. I want to make one point about Lowell's presentation. I did get to interview Francis Gertie. He lived past his 100th birthday, and till the end was extremely articulate and sharp-minded. When I interviewed him, it was right before that occasion. He remembered testifying in Congress on a hearing having to do with prohibition when the question was, did prohibition actually assist in reducing the incidence of mental impairment in the country? And his answer was no. He was asked to testify by Anton Cermak, who was the mayor of Chicago at the time, and was very, very much an opponent of prohibition. In any event, when Francis Gertie, Dr. Gertie, turned 100, he told an audience, and I don't recall the exact context of it, but he said one thing he regretted in his career was the fact that he was unable, as a professional psychiatrist, to treat Helena Kerner, Otto's wife, who I'm sure all of you know was suffering from the disease of alcoholism. And he remembered that and pointed it out at that occasion, and I think that tells us a couple of things. Number one, the extreme capability of the man, which Lowell has just stated, and number two, the fact that Otto Kerner's insistence upon reforming the Illinois mental health system was not entirely objective or devoid of personal involvement. He felt very strongly about the issue, in part because of the difficulties his wife was suffering. And he was able to internalize that feeling and then to bring it out, to manifest it in public policy. And I think that's a really remarkable aspect of the Kerner story. I want to touch briefly on two other issues that arose during his tenure that I think bear mention. The first is the fact that after the 1960 census, of course, the Illinois Constitution required, the Illinois Constitution at that time required that the state of Illinois' legislative districts be reapportioned and redrawn. And as is not unusual, the legislature, this is a very, very important function of the legislature in their eyes. And we know today about the whole controversy with respect to redistricting in certain states and what that produces and so on and so forth. But it was true to some extent even at that time. The legislature was unable to agree, was unable to agree on a map that really worked, and they ended up with something that really discriminated against certain parts of the state, most notably Lake County north of Chicago. And Kerner vetoed the bill. He vetoed the reapportionment bill. I think partly for political reasons. Mayor Daley didn't like it. The Democratic Party, I think it could be said, was opposed to it. But the point is that by vetoing the bill, the Constitution then required that there be an at-large election for the Illinois House. So in 1964, for the first time ever, and perhaps the first time anywhere in the country, you had a statewide election for the seats in a state legislature, the House of Representatives. And we had what is now fondly remembered as the bedsheet ballot. When you went to the polling place, you saw all the names. And the result of that, there were two results of that. First, both parties realized that in order to attract voter attention and voter sympathy, they had to put people on the ballot that were respectable, shall we say. And that's a term of art in Illinois politics. And they did, as the governor pointed out. We had Earl Eisenhower on the Republican side, and we had Adlai Stevenson on the Adlai Stevenson III, right, on the Democratic side, and there were other names of people who are well known. In other words, there was an effort to sort of dress up the whole aspect of electing political figures in the state. The second aspect, which I think you could probably attribute to the Lyndon Johnson landslide of the '64 election, the Democrats won a solid majority in the House and brought into Springfield people who were not career political figures in Illinois, many people who had run out of motives other than just entrenchment or just keeping a job and so on. In fact, several incumbent legislators were not slated because they had questionable backgrounds. And so for a period of time, you had in Springfield a cohort of individuals who really took a fresh look at Illinois government. And it made the second term of Otto Kerner, I think, probably more productive than it might have been otherwise. There was an anniversary meeting, lunch, a couple of years ago that I attended with Gene Schlickman of some of the people who were still living who were elected to the legislature at that time in 1964, Republicans and Democrats. It was a pretty lively group. And what they all said to a person was that how much they regret the current political discourse in Illinois and in this country generally. They all thought that even though they were opponents party-wise and so on, that they all got along. And I was very thankful that Gene invited me to attend that event, which reminds me that I should say that I'm here instead of Gene Schlickman, who was in the legislature, I believe, for 16 years, knew Otto Kerner, not well, but served in his time. And were it not for Gene Schlickman, I would not be here, because he was the guy who got the idea early on of doing a biography of Otto Kerner and was working on his own as a private attorney, having left the legislature. And he called me and said, "Would you like to join?" And I said yes, and the rest is history. So we made a good team, and then as was said, we published the biography of Justice John Paul Stevens. Now, the remainder of my time, I want to focus on one event or one accomplishment that occurred in the second term that I think represents what government should be at the state level. It also, in my humble opinion, is my favorite chapter in the book. And that is the victory that Illinois won in securing the National Accelerator Laboratory for Western Dupage County. This is a story that has many, many political and historical threads in it, and it's one where I think Otto Kerner used the same kind of determination that Lowell spoke of to obtain something that when the whole process of selecting the site for the laboratory, which is of course known as the Fermi Lab now, when that process began, there was absolutely no reason to believe that Illinois had any chance at all of winning that contest. This is just to briefly summarize, this was a program that began under the John F. Kennedy administration. And as you may remember, John F. Kennedy was very much in favor of moving the country forward with respect to space exploration, science, and so on. And there was a big push in Congress to provide funds for what was euphemistically called research and development. It became, in effect, a new form of pork barrel spending, except that the money went to physicists instead of road contractors. And most of the money, most of the facilities, most of the efforts were concentrated on the coasts. California, the New York area, the Midwest was sort of a desert, except that, as Otto Kerner pointed out on several occasions, the Midwest was the incubator of the brains. University of Illinois, University of Chicago, and other Midwestern universities were supplying the talent in the area of physical sciences that then these individuals often went out to the coast to work at the laboratories that existed at the time. So when Kennedy inspired the Congress to appropriate money for a particle accelerator, which would be the world's largest by far, almost 10 times the magnitude of the one that existed at the time in Long Island in New York, there was a mad scramble. It's just as Lowell has described you can smell the meat of cooking when the idea of building this massive project that would employ thousands of scientists, and not to mention the construction work and the maintenance, all of that was thrown out to the public. Every congressperson, every senator wanted that project. And as we learned later, it was a bit of political stealth by a gentleman named Seaborg, who was the chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission. He figured out, and this is pretty good political thinking, that in order to get the funding at a time of relative austerity in the federal budget, in order to get the funding for the accelerator, he wanted to make it a contest about who would get it, what state, what region, what community would obtain this wonderful project. And by having the competition, he thought correctly that people would ignore the fact that they're spending an awful lot of money for something nobody understood. So the competition supplanted the basic question of why are we doing this in the minds of the public. So there was a national competition, and the effect in Illinois was not only to cite here an internationally well-known facility where people all over the world came to do research. It had another effect, which I think makes the story even more interesting, and that is that when the site selection process was in play, there was some concern, competitive concern, in New York and California and elsewhere that was raised about the fact that Illinois at that time did not have what was called an open occupancy law. That is to say that a law of the state prohibiting discrimination on the basis of race in the sale of housing. There was no state law, and in fact, in much of the state, there was a sort of an understated or little understood provisions in real estate contracts that permitted the seller of the home to, in effect, say, I don't want you to say to the realtor, I don't want you to show my home to any African Americans, and so on. This was very common, particularly in Dupage County, where the accelerator ended up. So in terms of the competitive aspect of getting the accelerator, this point was raised, not only by political figures, but also by the scientific community. The physicists who were going to come to this accelerator project, wherever it was put, made it plain to everyone involved that they would not want to go to a place where people of minorities and others were in any way discriminated against in schools, housing, or any other public accommodations. And as a result of that, Kerner faced a dilemma because at that time, the Illinois legislature was not about to enact a statewide open occupancy law. And so he did something that we see occasionally on the part of political executives at the state and federal level. He used his executive power to solve the problem. And it's, I think, a fascinating little story. There was a little-known state agency that basically rubber stamped the application of anyone who wanted to be a realtor in Illinois, have a real estate license, real estate brokerage license. You could get that simply by applying to this board, and it was approved, and as far as I know, almost no one was ever turned down. Kerner appointed to head the board an African American. First time in history of Illinois, an African American headed this unknown agency that had the power to approve real estate licenses. The agency then, under this man, his name was Oscar Brown Sr., enacted a rule that said that we will not issue a license to any real estate agent in Illinois, or is any agency license now existing credible if the broker discriminates in any way at the instruction of the seller or anyone else against minorities in the sale of housing. And overnight, Illinois suddenly opened up, and it was a slow process to fully implement, but the point is that he took action that solved the problem in terms of Illinois' image at that time as a place that discriminated against housing. And I think that from a political standpoint, from an executive standpoint, and just from the moral standpoint, that was a major achievement of the administration.
Thank you. Bill, do you have something you'd like to add as far as what do you view as Otto Kerner's major achievement, or that we haven't talked about?
I would like to add a couple things. Probably the primary thing I'd like to add has to do with higher education. I think you could describe the decade that Otto Kerner was in office as the golden age of higher education, public higher education in the state of Illinois. And to understand that, you have to understand what he inherited. In 1900, the state of Illinois had 6 state-supported higher education institutions. University of Illinois, which is a university, Southern Illinois University, which started out as a teacher's college, became a university. Then it had Eastern, Western, Northern, and Illinois State. That was in 1900. 61 years later, when he took over, Illinois had 6 institutions of higher education, the same ones I just named. The only difference was the U of I had 2 or 3 professional schools, like a medical school in Chicago, and they had a 2-year program at Navy Pier. Everything else was just the same. The baby boom was almost upon us. Everybody was trying to get a handle on this. If you notice where those institutions were located, none of them were in Chicago, none of them were in Cook County, none of them were in the collar counties, none of them were in Rockford or Peoria, the 2 other largest cities in the state, none were in the Quad Cities, none were in the Metro East area. So what happened, basically, is that Governor Kerner got passed, and there have been attempts in the Stratton administration to pass something like a Board of Higher Education. He got that passed in 1961 over the opposition of the U of I and SIU, who were normally competitive with each other in legislature, but on that one they both agreed they didn't need a Board of Higher Education. The Board of Higher Education had only 2 absolute powers: to approve new programs and new non-instructional capital facilities. It also, though, was instructed to prepare a master plan for higher education and to prepare recommendations on appropriations every 2 years, because there was bienniums, to the General Assembly. If anybody's been around here for a while, you know there's probably 3 rooms full of master plans and recommendations to the General Assembly. Nothing happened. Once that was passed, Governor Kerner named a guy named Ben Heineman, who was a former classmate of his, Northwestern Law School, was head of the Chicago Northwestern Railroad, as chairman of the Board of Higher Education, named a strong board. And when the universities came to him to get approval for their appropriations, he said, run it through the Board of Higher Education, which suddenly changed the role of the Board of Higher Education, becoming much, much more strong than it had been in the past. And he also told them, prepare a master plan, and I want to get going on that. Well, there was a number of results of that. Probably the most significant is that in 1965, Governor Kerner had gotten together all the parties, Democrats, Republicans, legislative leaders, educators, and eventually put together a plan to form a community college system, which Illinois had the first community college in the country in Joliet Junior College around 1900, had hardly any after that. They put it together, and by the time he left office, they already had 30 community colleges in the state of Illinois. Now they have 44. Community colleges enroll more than 4 out of every 10 college students in the state of Illinois. They're close, they're affordable. You know, people can go there, and during these very costly times for higher education, this has been one of the real saviors for the state of Illinois, that we have a community college system. He also did quite a bit in other areas. The U of I got Chicago Circle, which became the University of Illinois Chicago, which is a major, of course, institution in Chicago. He took over 2 colleges that had been set up by the Chicago Board of Education, called Chicago Teachers College North, Chicago Teachers College South. They became Northeastern Illinois State University, Chicago State University. gave to a couple of additions to U of I and Peoria and Rockford to their medical school system. He authorized, for example, for SIU to get a dental school in Alton, a medical school in Springfield, U of I, Southern Illinois University in Edwardsville, and then they created two schools which were capstone schools. One was Saginaw State University, and the other one was Governor State University up near Chicago. So in just 8 years, he basically transformed the face of higher education. And that's still the same face we have today. He created something called the Illinois Building Authority, which is a predecessor to the Capital Development Board, which allowed the funding of these through bonds. And there was a massive building spree, and it came in time to help Illinois out a very great deal. So I thought in many ways, that was his most significant accomplishment that's probably lasted. He's also, he also really established an economic climate. You know, Illinois during his term became the leading export state in the country, a combination farm, agriculture, and manufactured products. He had, the capstone is the one you described as the Fermi Lab, but of course there was a huge new Chrysler plant in Belvedere, steel plant up near Hennepin, but the real growth came in all the other businesses that were coming to Illinois. In those days, nobody talked about the Rust Belt. Illinois had a great influx of population coming in, much of it to the northeastern part of the state. I think, from my observations, that probably Governor Kerner dealt the most with the Department of Economic Development, which was created during his 8 years, to serve as a salesman for the state of Illinois. Led a couple of trade missions, first governor, I think, ever to do that, to other countries, you know, and he understood that tourism was a big part of economic development too. And so they had Wren Lake in southern Illinois. He pushed very hard for Carlisle and Shelbyville. He added tens of thousands, well, like 20,000 acres to various parks like Illinois Beach State Park. All of those drew things there. I'd say one last thing, which he doesn't get credit for, but which it wouldn't have happened without him, I think, is that the Illinois State Bar Association, the Chicago Bar Association, have been pushing very hard for a new judicial article to the Illinois Constitution. Illinois had political selection of judges. They were having trouble getting lawyers to be judges because you might get voted out 2 years later because of the political endorsements. They were very concerned about it. They lined up virtually everybody, every organization in the state except for two organizations to support that. The two organizations that weren't in favor were the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. But basically what happened is when he got elected, he now had come in on a big win in 1960 over Governor Stratton. And even though they had failed in previous efforts in the 1950s to accomplish that, he endorsed that project. And he could have killed that in one of two ways. He could have opposed it, which would have killed it. Or he could have said, this is my project, it's terrific, and this is my program, I'm going to take it over. That would have killed it too. Because everybody was very suspicious at the time. The Democrats and Republicans had to be dragged to the bargaining table to agree to it, to put it together. Each of them thought the other party was getting an advantage. They complained, it seemed to me, about an equal level, so it appeared to me it was probably pretty fair. It's the same system we have now. It's probably not what it should be, probably not what it could be. It sure isn't what it was. And it was a huge, huge advantage to have that judicial article passed in 61, 62.
Thank you, Bill. Now we're going to throw it open. We've got about 15 minutes. If